In the winter of 1900, the wind in Wyoming didn't just knock on doors. It crept into walls, stole warmth from sleeping children, and turned nights into quiet battles no one talked about out loud. On the edge of a small frontier town, one cowboy watched his young son struggle to breathe while the stove burned itself tired. Everyone told him this was just how winter worked. But Silas Crow wasn't fighting the cold. He was about to challenge the wind itself. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Laramie, Wyoming, in the first winter of the new century, did not feel like a town so much as a hard decision made permanent. It sat high on the open plain, pinned between a wide, pale ski and the dark outline of the snowy range, and the wind treated it the way the ocean treats a pier, always testing, always leaning, always trying to pry loose whatever was proud enough to stand. On certain mornings the air looked clean as glass and still stung like a slap. On others, the weather rolled in low and fast, a gray herd of cloud dragging snow behind it in thin, angry sheets that skittered across the street boards and the railroad siding. The cold had a personality here, not the quiet, respectful cold of a forest valley, but a restless, needling cold that crept under collars and into seams, that rattled the stovepipe lids and made every door in town complain when it opened. Men in Laramie did not ask if it was cold. They asked what the wind was doing, because wind was the difference between discomfort and danger, between a night of sleep and a night of feeding a stove until your hands shook. The town itself was a rough necklace of buildings strung along the Union Pacific line, a depot that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, a feed store with sacks stacked like sleeping animals, a saloon with warped swinging doors and a piano that sounded like it had survived a war, and rows of narrow houses that hunkered down behind fences that were more habit than help. Beyond that strip of human insistence, the land opened into brown winter grass and sagebrush, and then into nothing but distance. Laramie's streets were never fully quiet. Even at dawn you could hear the telegraph wire humming, the groan of a wagon axle, the cough of a horse, the faint clink of a blacksmith's hammer, and always the wind, threading itself through all sounds like a fiddle string. Silas Crow lived on the edge of that insistence, where town ended and the plain began, in a small house he had built with his own hands the summer before. He was 34 and built like a man who had learned to stand his ground against animals larger than himself. Broad shoulders, narrow hips, forearms ropey with old strain, and hands shaped by reins and tools, hands that looked too big to be gentle until you saw him lift something fragile without thinking. His face had sharp angles that the wind seemed to enjoy, high cheekbones, a straight nose that had once been broken and healed slightly off-center, and a jaw that held itself firm even when he smiled. He wore a short, neat mustache and kept his beard scraped close when he had time, not out of vanity but because he disliked the way frost collected in long stubble. His hair was dark brown, almost black when wet, usually flattened by a hat in the constant weather. People in town said he had a calm to him, but it was the calm of a man who had already used up his panic in younger years. When Silas spoke, he didn't waste words, and when he laughed, it was brief and dry, like a match struck in a cold room. That steadiness had not come from luck. It had been hammered into him by the kind of work that punished daydreams. Silas was a cowboy. Yes, he could ride a stubborn horse and read a trail the way some men read a newspaper, but he was also a mechanic for the railroad when the season allowed. He'd spent years fixing what others used and broke: freight wagon hubs, pump leathers, harness buckles, stove grates, and most importantly, anything with a bolt that might loosen under vibration. In his 20s, he'd drifted north for a time, working near army posts and supply yards, learning how men built quick shelter when they could not afford comfort. He rarely spoke of those years. The only hint sat behind his eyes when a storm came in, an old, practiced attention, like a soldier listening for something that hadn't happened yet. He didn't live alone. Elena Crow moved through the house like warmth, trying not to be wasted. She was 29, slender but not frail, with a posture that stayed straight even when she was tired, as if she had promised herself long ago she would not be bent by hard seasons. Her hair was chestnut brown, thick, and usually pinned up in a twist that loosened by evening into soft flyaways around her neck. Her skin was olive-toned, weathered slightly from sun and wind, but her eyes, hazel, steady, direct, kept a brightness that made strangers answer her kindly even when they meant to be gruff. Elena had grown up in a railroad town farther east, the kind of place that taught a person how to be practical without becoming mean. She could sew a torn coat by lamplight, haggle over flour without blushing, and still pause to admire a ribbon of sunset between snow clouds. When she worried, she did not dramatize it. She simply grew quieter, and that quiet was more alarming than shouting. Their son, Tommy, was 4, small for his age and quick in his movements like a sparrow. His hair was light, almost blonde, and always stood up in odd directions no matter how Elena tried to smooth it. His cheeks were often pink from the cold, and his mouth tended toward a serious line until something amused him, at which point his whole face would brighten suddenly, as if a lamp had been lit behind his eyes. Tommy had been born with lungs that did not like thin air and bitter wind. He could play hard for an hour and then cough as if he had been running all day. The town doctor called it a weakness, with the shrug of a man who had seen too many weaknesses to name each one. Silas heard something else in that diagnosis, a warning, plain and sharp. In Laramie, a child with weak lungs did not get the luxury of a careless winter. On the first morning the story truly began. The wind rose before dawn and came in steady from the northwest, pushing cold straight down from the mountains like a hand pressing on the back of your neck. Silas woke to the sound of it worrying the eaves. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the stove, banked low and red. Elena slept on her side, one hand curled near Tommy where he had climbed into their bed sometime in the night. Tommy's breathing was shallow and a little fast, the way it got when the air was too dry. Silas lay still for a moment and listened to the house as if it were an animal. There were small sounds, wood contracting, a nail shifting, the soft tick of the stovepipe as the heat faded. Then he heard it. The faintest whisper of moving air where there should have been none, a draft threading through some seam he had missed. It was so light it could have been imagined, but Silas did not imagine drafts. Drafts were real, and real things killed. He slipped out of bed without waking them. The floorboards were cold under his feet. He fed 2 pieces of split pine into the stove and watched the flame catch, bright and eager, then die down into steadier heat. The stove was a cast-iron box with scars of use, set on a slab of stone. It was the heart of the house, and it demanded constant attention like an infant. Silas had built the cabin tight. He had believed in tightness the way men believe in good rope, but the first true cold had taught him what older builders rarely said out loud. A cabin could be well built and still bleed warmth like a wounded animal. The wind did not simply chill the air. It pulled heat from walls, from corners, from every place where warm met cold. It made the very structure feel like it had turned against you. He moved along the window frames with the back of his hand, feeling for the sting of air. The north window, despite its putty and its cloth strip, had a bite to it. He pressed harder on the sash and felt it settle a hair. Better, but not solved. At the baseboard near the front door, where Elena stuffed rags each night, the draft was stronger. The rags had frozen stiff, their edges crusted with pale frost. Silas crouched there, his knees cracking quietly, and touched the wood. Cold. Not just cool, cold like the outside had reached through the wall and taken hold. A small, sour humor rose in him. He imagined the wind grinning, invisible, satisfied. He could almost hear it saying, "Is that all you've got, cowboy?" A cough came from the bedroom. Tommy, then another. Elena stirred, blinking, sitting up with her hair loosened and her face still soft with sleep. She didn't ask if it was cold. She listened, like Silas did. "He's tight," she said, meaning Tommy's chest, her voice low. She pulled the quilt closer around the boy and rubbed his back in slow circles. Tommy's small shoulders rose and fell, trying to behave. "It's the wind," Elena added. "He was fine yesterday afternoon." Silas nodded, but his eyes stayed on the frozen rags at the baseboard. The stove crackled, throwing warmth into the room the way a man throws coins into a well. Hopeful, repetitive, not always rewarded. The light from the stove made the walls glow amber, but the corners still looked gray. He stood and reached for his coat, a thick wool thing rubbed shiny at the elbows. "I'll fetch more wood," he said, but the words tasted wrong as soon as he said them. More wood was the answer everyone used. More wood was also a race you could lose. Elena watched him with that steady, direct gaze. She was not accusing. She was not panicking. She was simply there, a person who shared the same weather and the same child. "Silas," she said quietly, "we can't do this all winter. Not like last week. You slept in pieces. You were up every 2 hours. He can't keep breathing like that." She tried to keep humor in it, the kind that kept fear from getting too big. "If you go to war with the stove will win. It's made of iron." A sound came from outside, hoofbeats on the hard ground, then the creak of leather. Through the front window, Silas saw a rider passing along the fence line, head lowered against the wind. The figure was broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long coat, moving with the easy balance of someone born to saddles. The rider lifted a hand in a brief salute without slowing, and Silas recognized him. Marshall Briggs, owner of the Bucking Rail Saloon, a man in his 40s with a red-brown beard and the kind of grin that could turn friendly or sharp depending on whether he was selling you whiskey or judging your choices. Briggs was the sort who always seemed warm, even in winter, as if the world's rules bent slightly around his confidence. He didn't stop. He merely rode on, the wind swallowing him quickly, leaving behind only a drifting strip of snow and the suggestion of laughter. Silas watched until the rider became a blur in the white, then turned back to the stove, to Elena's hand on Tommy's back, to the frozen rags and the cold biting through the walls. He felt, with sudden clarity, that the problem was not his carpentry. It was not his effort. It was the physics of a place where wind never truly rested. He did not yet have a solution, not the shape of it, not the materials, but he had the beginning of one, an idea as plain as a fence post and as stubborn as a mule. You couldn't outburn the wind. You had to stop it from touching your house at all. He didn't say that aloud. Not yet. He only added another log to the stove and stood there, letting the heat wash over his hands, while outside, Laramie's winter kept pacing the town like a mythic beast looking for something to break. In the bedroom doorway, Elena held Tommy closer and watched Silas the way a person watches a man standing near a river that he intends to cross. Silas met her eyes once, and in that look was a promise he couldn't name, only feel. He would find a way for their home to become more than a brave little box in a sea of wind. The chapter ended with the wind still howling, but with something new inside the cabin, an enemy finally understood, and a cowboy who had stopped thinking about fighting harder and started thinking about fighting smarter. By the time the sun cleared the low rim of cloud that morning, the wind had settled into a steady, deliberate pace, as if it had decided this day belonged to it. Silas Crow stood outside his cabin with his coat buttoned high and his hat pulled down, watching the way loose snow slid across the ground in thin, whispering sheets. It moved not randomly, but with intent, gathering speed in open stretches and slowing where fences or wagon ruts broke its path. He followed it with his eyes the way a tracker follows sign, noting where it struck hardest and where it lost its teeth. The cold bit cleanly at his cheeks, but what held his attention was not the temperature. It was the pressure, the invisible shove against the walls of his house, the way the wind leaned on the structure as though testing its patience. Behind him, the cabin looked sound enough. The logs were tight, the corners cleanly notched, the roof pitched steep to shed snow. By any measure passed down through Wyoming winters, it should have been sufficient. Silas knew that now meant nothing. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass, pausing at each wall to place his palm flat against the wood. On the south side, warmed briefly by weak sun, the logs felt merely cool. On the north and west walls, they felt dead, robbed of warmth, as if the night had never let go. The wind slid along those surfaces and took something with it, again and again, patient as erosion. A low nicker sounded from the small corral east of the house. Silas turned and saw Buck standing with his head over the fence rail, ears angled back against the wind. Buck was a bay gelding of indeterminate age, somewhere past 10, with a deep chest and a sway just beginning in his back. His coat had dulled with years of work, but his legs were still straight and his eyes steady, dark and observant. Buck had learned long ago that fighting the wind wasted energy. He stood angled to it, presenting the least surface possible. Tail tucked, breathing slow. Silas respected that horse for the same reason he respected men who didn't talk much. Buck had learned by living. "You've got the right idea," Silas muttered, rubbing the horse's neck through the fence. Buck leaned into the touch briefly, then shifted to put his hindquarters more squarely against the gusts. The wind whistled through the corral rails and fell quiet just behind the horse's bulk. Silas noticed that too. Everything cast a wind shadow, everything, even something alive. The thought followed him back inside, where Elena was coaxing water to heat on the stove. The cabin smelled faintly of pine smoke and damp wool. Tommy sat at the small table with a wooden horse Silas had carved the previous winter, pushing it along the scarred surface in slow, careful circles. His breathing sounded better than it had before dawn, but there was still a tightness there, a faint rasp that made Silas's jaw set. Elena glanced up as Silas came in, reading his face the way she always did. "You're thinking," she said, not accusing, not amused, just stating a fact. She poured water into a chipped basin and tested it with her fingers. "That kind of thinking usually means you're about to do something the town will talk about." Silas shrugged out of his coat and hung it on a peg. "Town talks whether I do anything or not." He knelt to Tommy's level and smoothed the boy's hair, earning a brief grin. "How's your chest?" Tommy considered this seriously. "It feels like when I run too fast," he said. "But I didn't run." Silas nodded, absorbing that with a quiet anger that had no place to go yet. "All right, you take it easy today." He stood and reached for a cup. The coffee was thin and bitter, but it was hot, and that mattered. Later that morning, Silas rode into town. Buck moved with his usual economy, head low, hooves striking sparks from frozen ground near the main street. Laramie looked the same as it did. Always did in winter, men hunched in their coats, women moving briskly between shops, horses tied with their backs to the wind. The Bucking Rail Saloon stood open despite the hour, its windows fogged, the smell of stale smoke and fresh sawdust leaking out each time the door swung. Silas tied Buck and went first to the feed store, then to the hardware supplier, a narrow building run by Amos Harlan. Amos was a man in his late 50s, tall but stooped, with a beard gone almost entirely white and hands permanently stained by oil and rust. His eyes were sharp behind wire spectacles, and he had the habit of listening longer than most men expected. He'd come west young, failed once at ranching, and reinvented himself by selling other people the tools to succeed where he had not. Amos nodded when Silas entered, taking in the frost on his hat brim and the thoughtful set of his mouth. "Morning, Crow," Amos said. "You look like you're either fixing something or about to break it. Worse." "Morning," Silas replied. "I need to look at your sheet metal, corrugated if you've got it, and timber, straight pieces." Amos's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's a combination," he said. "What are you building?" Silas didn't answer right away. He ran a hand over a stack of thin metal panels, cold enough to sting. "Not building," he said finally. "Blocking." Amos studied him for a moment longer, then nodded as if filing the word away for later. "Got some panels from a dismantled stock shed," he said. "Not pretty, serviceable." He leaned closer. "Wind giving you trouble?" "Wind gives everyone trouble," Silas said. "I just plan to answer back." By midday, word had begun to spread, as it always did. When Silas stopped at the blacksmith's yard to ask about spare brackets and bolts, he found Ezra Pike working the forge. Ezra was younger than Silas by a few years, broad through the shoulders, with arms corded by hammer work, and a beard that grew thick and uneven, singed in places from years of sparks. He had once been quick to laugh and quicker to anger, until a winter accident had crushed 2 fingers on his left hand. Since then he'd moved slower, spoken less, and watched more. Ezra set down his hammer and squinted at Silas. "Amos says you're buying metal," he said. "That true?" "Some," Silas replied. "And wood." Ezra snorted softly. "You building yourself a fortress?" Silas met his gaze. "More like a fence, just not for cattle." Ezra's expression shifted, curiosity edging out humor. "You trying to keep something out?" "Trying to keep something from touching," Silas said. "There's a difference." Ezra leaned back against the anvil, arms crossed. "Wind," he said, not asking. When Silas nodded, Ezra rubbed his damaged hand absently. "Wind took my fingers," he added. Well, not directly. He gestured toward the yard where a half-finished wagon stood. I was cold, rushed, made a bad grab. He shrugged. If you figure out how to make it mind its business, I'll listen. That afternoon, Silas walked the edges of town and beyond, looking not for materials but for examples. He watched how haystacks were arranged to shelter cattle, how snow drifted deep behind them while the upwind side stayed scoured. He noted how abandoned wagons, tipped on their sides, created calm pockets where weeds still stood upright. He crouched near a low rock outcrop and felt the stillness in its lee, the way the air seemed to pause there, heavy and reluctant to move. The pattern was everywhere once he allowed himself to see it. Still air was warmth's ally. Moving air was its enemy. By the time he returned home, the light had gone flat and gray. Elena met him at the door, pulling it closed quickly behind him. "Tommy's been better this afternoon," she said. He played without stopping to cough. Her relief was cautious, like someone afraid to name good fortune too loudly. Silas set down the bundle of hardware and sat at the table, spreading out rough sketches on scrap paper, lines, arrows, notes written and crossed out. Elena leaned over his shoulder, studying them. "You're not talking yet," she said. "That usually means you're serious." "I'm thinking about a second skin," Silas said at last. "Not on the inside, on the outside. Something that takes the wind first before it ever touches the logs." Elena straightened slowly. "Around the whole house?" "Yes." There was a long pause. The stove hissed softly. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls again, impatient. Elena folded her arms, not defensively, but to think. "People will stare," she said. "They already do." "They'll stare anyway," Silas replied. "This way they might stare at something that works." She searched his face for doubt and found none, only that steady calm that came when he had decided. "Will it be safe?" she asked. "It'll be solid," Silas said. "And it won't touch the cabin. There'll be space, air that doesn't move much." He tapped the paper. "Like standing behind Buck in a storm." Elena smiled despite herself. "Trust the horse," she said. That night, as the wind roared and the stove glowed red, Silas lay awake and listened. Not with dread, but with attention. He was no longer simply enduring the sound. He was measuring it, imagining how it might slide over something curved, how it might lose itself in a gap it could not fill with force. Outside, the town slept in fits, feeding fires, cursing drafts. Inside the crow cabin, a man who had finally named his enemy began in earnest to plan its defeat. Silas Crow did not begin with hammer and nail. He began with walking. For 3 mornings after he spoke the idea aloud to Elena, he rose before light and circled the house, the corral, the yard, and the bare ground beyond, as if he were learning the place for the first time. The wind changed its mood each day, sometimes rushing in sharp and level, sometimes dropping low and rolling like water over stone. Silas let it show him where it preferred to strike. He watched snow scour itself clean from one corner of the cabin while piling knee-deep behind the woodshed. He noted how the stovepipe sang when gusts hit it square, and how it fell silent when the air slid past at an angle. He sketched at the table by lamplight afterward, not pretty drawings but honest ones, lines weighted where pressure would land, arrows softened where air would lose its urgency. Elena followed this quiet ritual with a patience born of shared winters. She didn't rush him. She kept the house steady, meals simple. And hot, Tommy bundled and rested, the small routines that held a family together when the weather tried to pull it apart. Tommy's breathing improved in small increments that mattered enormously. Fewer pauses between play and rest, fewer nights waking to cough. Each improvement sharpened Silas's resolve. He was no longer thinking about comfort. He was thinking about margin, the thin space between harm and safety. The first material arrived on a flatbed wagon borrowed from Amos Harlan. The corrugated metal panels were dull with age, edges nicked and rusted in places but still sound. Silas stacked them on timbers near the cabin, angling them so the wind slid off instead of rattling them to noise. He worked with methodical care, setting aside the worst pieces, measuring the rest twice. He wanted no seams that begged to be pried at. He wanted no corners that invited a fight. A dog appeared on the second afternoon, as dogs sometimes do, wandering into a place where something interesting is happening. She was a young shepherd mix, all legs and cautious curiosity, with a thick tan coat darkening along the spine and a black mask that made her eyes look larger than they were. One ear stood upright, the other folded halfway, as if undecided. She kept her distance at first, watching from the lee of the woodshed, tail low but not tucked. When Silas glanced her way, she didn't flee. She tilted her head, studying him as intently as he studied the wind. "Looks like you found a helper," Elena said from the doorway, smiling despite herself. Silas crouched and extended a hand, palm down. The dog approached in a slow arc, sniffed, and accepted the offered contact with a careful press of her nose. Her fur was warm under his fingers, dense and clean. "She knows where the calm is," he said. The dog circled behind him and lay down in the narrow strip of stillness between his body and the stacked panels, eyes half-lidded. Silas nodded once, as if the point had been argued and settled. They called her Ash, for the color of her coat and for the way she seemed to settle wherever the air was quiet. By the fourth day, Ezra Pike came out from town, drawn by curiosity he would have denied if asked. He arrived on foot, coat collar turned up, beard roughened by frost. He stood for a time without speaking, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes tracing the curve Silas had marked in stakes and string around the cabin. Ezra's gaze was sharp. He had learned to compensate for what his left hand could no longer do by watching more closely than most. "You're not making it square," Ezra said at last. "No," Silas agreed. "Square gives the wind something to grab." Ezra grunted approval. "Curves make it slide," he said, "like water around a stone." He shifted his weight, studying the spacing. "You leaving a gap?" "A wide one," Silas replied. "Air that doesn't move much." Ezra nodded slowly. "I can help with brackets," he said, as if the offer had surprised him. "If you want. Got a way to bend them without cracking." Silas did not ask why Ezra offered. He understood enough about men and winter. "I'd take it," he said simply. They worked together in the afternoons, the rhythm of it settling into something that felt older than talk. Ezra shaped brackets at the forge and brought them out warm, the iron smelling faintly sweet. Silas bolted them to posts sunk into the frozen ground with patient, incremental effort. He set the posts at regular intervals, measuring the distance to the cabin wall with a carpenter's rule, adjusting until the gap was consistent. He did not let the metal touch the logs. That separation mattered more than any thickness he could add. Marshal Briggs rode by twice that week and finally reined in, curiosity outweighing amusement. He dismounted with a flourish, his beard neatly trimmed, his coat of good wool brushed clean. Briggs always looked like a man prepared to be seen. He walked the perimeter, hands clasped behind his back, boots crunching. "You've built yourself a shell," he said, the word tasting new in his mouth. "Looks like a barn courting a house." Silas tightened a bolt and did not look up. "If it keeps the wind off, it can call itself what it likes." Briggs laughed, but there was something thoughtful in it. "You always were the sort to try things sideways," he said. "Town's taking bets on whether you freeze faster or slower." He tipped his hat toward the dog, who watched him without warmth. "Dog's smart, knows where to stand." "She does," Silas said. "That's why she's staying." By the end of the first week, the frame stood. Curved ribs rose around the cabin like the suggestion of a second spine, held apart by spacers and braced against the ground. Silas cut vent openings low and high, fitting them with simple baffles he could adjust. He thought often of moisture, not as an abstract problem, but as a real enemy that rotted wood and sickened air. The vents were his compromise with reality. Slow exchange, not silence. Snow came again, heavier this time, but the frame held. When the wind struck, it slid along the curve and fell away, leaving a pocket of relative calm between metal and log. Silas stepped into that pocket and felt it immediately, the way a person feels the difference between standing in a stream and stepping onto a rock mid-current. The air was cooler than inside, but it was not angry. It did not hurry. It did not strip warmth from his coat. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the muted sound of the storm, understanding with a clarity that settled his nerves. This would work, not perfectly, not magically, but enough. Inside, Elena noticed the change before the metal panels were fully fastened. The drafts softened. The stove held its heat longer. The night felt less like a contest. She said nothing at first, waiting as she always did for evidence that would not be undone by hope. When she finally spoke, it was a simple observation offered without ceremony. "It doesn't feel like the wind is in the room anymore," she said. Tommy slept that night without climbing into their bed. His chest rose and fell evenly, his small hand curled around the wooden horse. Ash slept curled in the new stillness, ear twitching at distant sound, but body relaxed. The last panel went on in a pale afternoon light, Ezra steadying the ladder while Silas set the final bolts. They stepped back together, shoulders brushing, and looked at the shape they had made. It was not beautiful in the way polished things are beautiful. It was beautiful the way a good fence is beautiful, or a well-set stone, by doing exactly what it was meant to do. Ezra wiped his hands on his trousers. "Town'll talk," he said. Silas nodded. "Town always does. But if it holds," Ezra went on, voice quieter, "they'll come looking." He flexed his damaged hand, thoughtful. Men listen when winter teaches. That evening, as the temperature dropped and the wind returned with familiar insistence, Silas fed the stove and waited. The metal skin answered the gusts with a low, sliding sound, like surf on shingle, and then quiet. The logs behind it stayed warm to the touch. He stood with Elena and felt the house hold. Outside, Laramie braced itself for another long night. Inside the Crow cabin, a new shape stood between a family and the wind, and for the first time since winter began, the difference could be felt, not imagined. The first true test did not arrive with drama. It came the way Wyoming weather often did, quietly, with a pause that felt like held breath. The morning opened pale and still, the sky stretched thin as bleached canvas, the wind absent in a way that made men uneasy rather than relieved. Silas Crow noticed it while splitting kindling. The axe bit clean, the chips fell straight down, and nothing tugged at his coat. Even Ash lifted her head and turned one ear, unsettled by the lack of movement. Silence, in Laramie, was never a promise, it was a warning. By noon, the temperature had dropped without announcement. The air thickened, sharpening each sound. From the west, a line of cloud rose low and heavy, darkening as it moved, not fast but with intention. Silas finished fastening the last seam on the outer skin, running his hand along the overlap, feeling for edges the wind might worry. The metal was cold but steady beneath his palm. He stepped back into the narrow corridor between shell and cabin, and stood there, letting the space speak. It was dim, the light filtered and softened, and the air carried the faint mixed scent of pine, iron, and snow. It did not move much. That mattered. Elena watched from the doorway, arms folded against the chill, studying the structure as if it were an animal she had agreed to let sleep near her child. "It sounds different," she said. Silas nodded. "The wind doesn't hit it square anymore. It slides." The storm arrived just before dusk. It came with a low roar that grew steadily, the kind that pressed on the ears before it reached the skin. Snow began as fine needles, then thickened into driven sheets. The first gust struck the house hard enough to make the metal answer with a long, sliding moan, like a bowed string. Elena stiffened despite herself. Tommy looked up from the floor, eyes wide. "It's all right," Silas said, though his own pulse had quickened. He fed the stove and closed the draft, then moved into the gap. Once more, listening. The wind rushed over the curved shell and broke apart, its force scattered and spent before it could reach the logs. He could hear it losing itself, like water poured over gravel. He rested his hand against the cabin wall from the outside and felt warmth there, stubborn and real. He smiled, just once, a small private thing. That night, the temperature plunged. It fell past numbers that usually sent men pacing their floors. Inside the Crow cabin, the stove burned steady and low. Elena cooked supper without gloves. Tommy ate, asked for more, and did not cough. Ash slept stretched out on her side in the corridor, belly rising slow and even, the unbothered sleep of a creature that trusted its instincts. Word travels strangely in winter. By the second day of the storm, people noticed the smoke. Or rather, they noticed the lack of it. Where other chimneys pumped thick plumes that flattened and dragged along the ground, the Crow chimney sent up a thin that rose before dissolving. Marshal Briggs noticed it from his saloon porch, mug warming his hands. He narrowed his eyes and watched the distant house at the edge of town, the odd curve now white with snow, shedding it cleanly. Damn fool might be onto something, he muttered, and pulled on his coat. The knock came mid-afternoon, sharp and uncertain. Elena opened the door to find a woman standing stiffly on the step, cheeks raw from cold, hair pinned tight beneath a wool hat. She was of middle height, built solid through the shoulders, with eyes the color of winter grass and a mouth that looked used to holding opinions back. "Sarah Lind," she said, voice clipped but polite. "I live 2 houses down from the schoolhouse." Elena stepped aside. "Come in." Sarah removed her gloves slowly, flexing her fingers. "I don't mean to pry," she said, gaze flicking toward the stove, then to Tommy sitting warm on the rug. "But my youngest hasn't stopped shivering since yesterday. I saw your smoke and thought, well." She hesitated, pride warring with concern. "It's warmer in here than it has any right to be." Silas came in from the corridor and nodded to her. "You're welcome to sit," he said. Sarah did, carefully, as if the warmth itself might prove temporary. "My husband's out with the section crew," she said. "I don't usually ask for help." Her eyes moved to the walls, the ceiling. "What did you do?" Silas did not give a speech. He explained simply, the outer skin, the space, the vents. He spoke as if describing fence repair. Sarah listened with the intensity of a woman who had learned to translate ideas into survival. "So you're not making more heat," she said slowly. "You're keeping the wind from stealing it." "That's it," Silas replied. She nodded once, decision made. "When the storm breaks," she said, "I'd like to look closer." That evening, Ezra Pike came by unannounced, beard-crusted, with ice, his eyes bright with the cold. He stood in the corridor, breathing slow, and laughed quietly. "It's calm," he said. "You feel that? Calm." He pressed his good hand against the metal. "Wind can't get its teeth in." They stood together while the storm raged outside, the house holding in a way that felt almost indecent. The wind battered and slid, unable to settle into its old work of stripping and prying. Inside, the air stayed even. The stove needed less tending. Silas let it burn down farther than he ever dared before and watched the thermometer hold. On the third night, when the cold deepened further, something happened that would have ended any argument if there had been one left to make. The stove went out. It was not a mistake. Silas did it deliberately. He banked the coals early and let the fire die, then waited. He sat at the table with Elena, the lamp burning low, listening to the wind's fury with a calm that surprised him. Hours passed. The house cooled, but slowly, reluctantly, like a large body that did not wish to give up what it held. When he checked the thermometer near dawn, it still read warmer than most cabins managed with a full fire. Elena touched his arm. "You don't have to prove it anymore," she said softly. Silas shook his head. "I needed to know," he replied, "for when things go wrong." Morning came gray and bitter. The storm finally loosened its grip and moved on, leaving the town stunned and exhausted. Men emerged from houses hollow-eyed, faces smoked and raw. They noticed the Crow place then, really noticed it. The snow lay deep around it, drifted where the shell had guided it, but the house itself looked untroubled, as if it had slept through the worst of it. By noon, 3 men stood in the yard. One was Marshall Briggs, beard rimed with frost, his usual grin subdued. One was a rancher named Thomas Keene, lean and sharp-faced, with a scar that pulled one corner of his mouth. Down, earned years ago when a frightened steer had taught him respect. The third was Jonah Reed, the schoolteacher, thin and pale, spectacles fogging as he breathed, unused to the cold despite years in Laramie. They did not speak at first. They simply looked. Briggs broke the silence. "You mind if we ask some questions?" Silas gestured toward the shell. "That's what it's for," he said. They walked the perimeter. They stepped into the corridor and felt the calm. Jonah Reed shivered once, not from cold, but from realization. "This is sensible," he said, sounding surprised by his own conclusion. Thomas Keene scratched his jaw. "Wish I'd thought of it," he said, not bitterly. "Lost 2 calves last night." Silas listened, answered where needed, and said nothing more. He had not built the shell to convince anyone. He had built it to keep his son breathing easily through the night. That goal had been met. Everything else was secondary. That evening, after the men. Left, Silas stood alone in the corridor as the sun dipped and the temperature began its familiar fall. The metal skin caught the last light and gave it back in a dull glow. The wind returned, as it always did, testing, pushing. The house answered back, not with defiance but with quiet refusal. The wind slid away, frustrated, and moved on to easier prey. Silas rested his hand against the warm log wall and felt a satisfaction that ran deeper than pride. He had not beaten the winter. He had learned how to live beside it. If Chapter 4 had been about survival, Chapter 5 became about proof. Not the loud kind, announced from porches or hammered into notice boards, but the quieter sort that settles into a place when enough people have seen the same thing with their own eyes and can no longer explain it away. Laramie woke after the storm sore and suspicious, like a boxer who had taken too many body blows. Men moved slower. Horses stood longer at hitching rails before being urged on. The wind, though diminished, still prowled the streets, testing doors and eaves as if offended by recent resistance. Silas Crow did not invite anyone to return. He went back to his routines with deliberate normalcy. He fed Buck, repaired a loose hinge on the woodshed, sharpened tools that did not strictly need it. He wanted the house to prove itself without his voice leaning on the scale. The outer shell shed snow cleanly as the sun climbed weak and pale. Meltwater ran down the curved metal and froze in scalloped patterns. Near the ground, never once creeping back toward the logs. Ash followed him everywhere, her gait loose and confident now, tail carried higher than before. She was no longer a visitor. She was a resident who understood the borders of safety better than most people. Elena felt the shift first, not in temperature, but in attention. When she walked to town for flour, conversations paused and resumed carefully as she passed. Women looked at her longer, measuring her coat, her color, the way she moved without the tight, guarded posture winter demanded. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Hanley, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and fingers permanently pricked by needles, leaned over the counter and spoke in a low voice. "Is it true you didn't have to keep the fire all night?" she asked, not accusing, not incredulous, simply hungry for information. "It's true," Elena said. "We slept." Mrs. Hanley closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that as if it were a story from a better place. "My sister's boy cried till dawn," she said. "Cold gets into their bones." She straightened, businesslike again. "If you don't mind, when the weather settles, I'd like to see how you've done it." By midweek, the visitors changed in kind. Where neighbors had come first, now came men whose lives revolved around numbers and responsibility. The first was Henry Caldwell, a railroad foreman with a reputation for fairness and a face shaped by years of squinting into sun and snow. He was in his early 50s, hair thinning and beard trimmed close, his hands broad and scarred but steady. Caldwell had overseen men through derailments, fires, and winter shortages. He did not believe in miracles. He believed in margins. He arrived on horseback with a notebook tucked into his coat and a thermometer clipped to his pocket watch chain. "Heard some talk," he said by way of greeting, his voice carrying the mild authority of someone used to being listened to. "Figured I'd see for myself." Silas did not bristle. He nodded and showed him the corridor, the vents, the overlaps. Caldwell moved slowly, measuring distances with his eyes, touching the metal, pressing his palm to the log wall the way Silas had. He took out his thermometer and waited, not once but 3 times, in different places. He wrote numbers down without comment. When he finally spoke, it was with the restrained tone of a man who had found something inconveniently true. "You're holding heat," Caldwell said. "More than you should be, given your fuel." He looked up. "If my bunkhouses did this, I'd save half my coal." Silas shrugged. "Wind steals first," he said. "Stop that. The rest behaves." Caldwell studied him, then smiled faintly. "You always were practical," he said. "Didn't know you were clever." The second visitor came the following day, and she brought a different weight. Martha Bell was the town midwife, a woman in her late 40s with hair pulled tight into a bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had delivered half the town's children and buried more than she liked. Her face was long and weathered, her hands strong, her posture unyielding. Cold worried her because it made fragile things break faster. She did not waste time on pleasantries. "I've had 3 babies this week with chests tight as drums," she said. "Mothers are doing everything right. It's the houses." She stepped into the crow cabin, inhaled, and nodded once. "This is better air," she said. "Warmer, but not stale." Silas showed her the vents, explaining how he adjusted them. Martha tested them herself, opening and closing, feeling the exchange. "You've given the air somewhere to go," she said. "That matters." She looked at Tommy, playing on the floor, cheeks pink but not strained. "This one breathes easier," she observed. It was not praise, it was assessment. That night, as the wind rose again, Silas noticed something. Else, the sound had changed. Where once it had been a constant shriek, it now broke into sections, sliding, lifting, moving on. The house answered not with groans, but with a muted, even tone. The corridor stayed dry. No frost crept inward. The logs held their warmth like men holding a line. Ezra Pike returned with a small group 2 evenings later, men he trusted enough to bring into something new. One was Caleb Morse, a young ranch hand with a shock of red hair and a habit of smiling too quickly, as if to soften the world before it could harden him. Another was Owen Blake, older, broad-backed, with a beard gone iron gray and eyes permanently narrowed by old disappointment. Owen had lost a wife to pneumonia 2 winters back and had not forgiven the cold since. He walked the corridor in silence, hand brushing the metal, jaw working. "This would have helped," he said at last, voice rough. "Not accusation, not regret, just fact." Silas felt the weight of that statement settle and let it pass. He had built the shell for his own family. He would not pretend it could undo the past. The conversations that followed were careful and practical. How much metal? How wide a gap? How to keep moisture from rotting the logs? Silas answered plainly. He did not promise miracles. He described trade-offs. The shell cost time. It required attention. It demanded respect for airflow and spacing. Men listened because the winter had taught them how to listen. By the end of the week, the first imitation appeared, not a full shell, but an attempt. Caleb Morse built a windbreak on the west side of his small cabin, angling it away from the wall, leaving space between. It was rough work, boards mismatched and nails bent, but the next night he slept longer than he had in days. He told no one at first. Then he told everyone. The town council met in the back room of the saloon on Sunday afternoon, more out of habit than authority. Marshal Briggs poured coffee instead of whiskey and kept his mfekas, jokes to himself. The men present were tired, practical, and quietly changed. Henry Caldwell spoke briefly about fuel savings. Martha Bell spoke about lungs. No one argued. They didn't vote on anything. They didn't need to. The idea had already moved beyond permission. Silas learned of the meeting later from Briggs, who stopped by with a sack of coffee beans as a pretext. "You've stirred the pot," Briggs said, not unkindly. "Town's talking about winter like it's a problem that can be managed. That's new." Silas watched Ash nose at the snow drifting off the shell. "Winter's still winter," he said. "We just stopped letting it into the house." That night, he did something he had not done in years. He slept without listening for the stove. He slept without counting hours. He slept the way men sleep when they trust the walls around them. Outside, the wind did what it always did, tested, prowled, moved on. Inside, the crow cabin held, steady and quiet, a small proof made solid against a century-old enemy. The trouble did not come from the wind. That would have been familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Trouble came instead in the shape of people trying to do something new with old confidence and learning, as winter insisted they must, that confidence alone did not keep a man warm. It began with a sound Silas Crow did not like. A hollow rattle, low and irregular, coming from the west side of the shell just after dawn. He stood in the corridor with Ash at his heel, listening. The wind was moderate, nothing like the storms they had already endured, but the sound persisted. A loose panel, perhaps, or a bracket that had shifted under stress. Silas pressed his hand against the metal and felt a faint vibration that hadn't been there before. Not dangerous yet, but careless if ignored. He fetched his wrench and tightened the offending bolt, then another beside it. The sound faded. He exhaled, slow and deliberate. The house, like any good tool, required attention. That was the part people forgot when something worked well. They assumed it would go on working without them. By mid-morning, the yard filled with tracks that did not belong to the crows. Hoof prints, boot marks, the unmistakable signs of visitors. Silas straightened from the woodpile and saw 2 wagons pulled up near the fence. Ezra Pike stood with them, his posture stiff with responsibility, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Beside him was a man Silas did not recognize, tall and spare, with a long, narrow face and a beard trimmed to a sharp point. He wore a wool coat cut a little too fine for ranch work and carried himself with the assured stiffness of someone used to being obeyed. "That'll be Arthur Hale," Ezra said quietly when Silas approached. "County building inspector, out of Cheyenne." Arthur Hale stepped forward before introductions could be made. He was in his early 40s, hair light and thinning at the temples, eyes pale and appraising. His boots were polished, despite the mud, and his gloves remained on his hands, as if the world itself were something he preferred not to touch directly. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I've had some reports." Silas inclined his head. "About my house." "About the additions," Hale corrected, gaze sliding over the shell. "There's concern. Unregulated construction, potential hazard, collapse under snow load, moisture trapping, fire risk." He spoke smoothly, each phrase delivered as if already recorded somewhere official. Silas listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that interrupting men like Hale only prolonged matters. "You're welcome to inspect," he said when the list ran dry. Hale raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the lack of resistance. He stepped into the corridor, boots echoing softly on the packed ground. He touched the metal, the spacers, the vents. He frowned at the chimney penetration, though Silas could see his eyes tracking the clearances and the careful flashing. Hale produced a notebook and made several notes, his pen scratching in quick, decisive strokes. "This isn't standard," Hale said finally. "No," Silas agreed. "Standard exists for a reason." "So does winter," Silas replied, not sharply, just plainly. Hale's mouth tightened. "I'll need to file a report," he said. "Until then, I'd advise against encouraging others to copy this. People get hurt when they improvise." Ezra shifted beside Silas, jaw working. He said nothing. Silas met Hale's gaze steadily. "I don't encourage anyone," he said. "I answer questions." Hale nodded once curtly. "That may need to stop." He turned on his heel and left, coat flaring slightly in the cold air. The wagons departed soon after, leaving behind churned snow and a silence that felt heavier than the inspector's words. Ezra let out a breath he'd been holding. "That man's got winter soft hands," he muttered. "Never lifted a beam in a tut-tut-ted. Gale." "Doesn't matter," Silas said. "Paper weighs as much as weather, sometimes." The next trouble came faster. 2 days later, near dusk, a shout carried across the plain from the direction of the Morse place. Silas was already moving before he fully understood it. He swung into Buck's saddle, Ash sprinting alongside, and rode hard against the wind. Caleb Morse stood in his yard, coat flapping, eyes wide with a mix of fear and embarrassment. The windbreak he'd built had partially failed. One side had pulled loose, boards rattling and threatening to tear free entirely. Snow blew straight into the gap, scouring the cabin wall beyond. "I thought I'd spaced it enough," Caleb said, voice raised to be heard. "Didn't brace the corners right." Silas dismounted and assessed in seconds. The boards were too flat, the angle too shallow. The wind had found purchase and worried it like a loose tooth. "Get inside," Silas said. "Now." He handed the reins to Ezra, who had followed on foot and began hauling boards free before they could become weapons. They worked fast, hands numbing, muscles burning. Silas adjusted angles, added temporary bracing, left a wider gap where Caleb had tried to close it tight. Ash barked sharply once when a board tore loose, then settled again, watching the calmer pocket form behind the adjusted structure. When it was done, the wind slid past instead of slamming home. Caleb sagged against the wall, breathing hard. "I didn't mean to make a mess of it," he said, cheeks flushed. Silas clapped him once on the shoulder. "You learned," he said. "That's not a mess." The incident traveled faster than success ever did. By morning, it had grown teeth in the telling, improvised structures failing, near accidents, warnings ignored. Arthur Hale returned, this time with 2 men from town council in tow, their expressions tight with concern. Henry Caldwell arrived as well, summoned by rumor and responsibility. He stood apart at first, watching both sides, his lined face thoughtful. Martha Bell came later, shawl pulled tight, eyes sharp. She did not speak until Hale finished his renewed warnings. "No one was hurt," Martha said then, voice cutting cleanly through the cold air. "And that boy's house is warmer today than it was before. That matters." Hale bristled. "That's not the point." "It is to the lungs," Martha replied, "and to the children." Caldwell stepped forward. "We don't stop men from fixing fences because someone hammers a post wrong," he said. "We show them how to do it right." He turned to Silas. "If you're willing." Silas nodded once. "I am." What followed was not a proclamation, but a practice. Over the next week, Silas found himself standing in yards and barns, explaining spacing, angles, bracing. He insisted on curved surfaces where possible, on gaps that let air slow rather than trap moisture. He warned against copying blindly. "The wind here comes low and fast," he told them. "Your place might be different. Watch it first." Arthur Hale attended one of these demonstrations, notebook in hand, face guarded. He did not interrupt. He did not approve. But he watched, and his questions shifted from prohibition to precision. How wide was too wide? How much overlap prevented rattling? What spacing failed under load? Silas answered carefully, aware that each word might find its way into a ledger. At home, Elena felt the strain in a different way. Their house had become a place of learning, and learning brought people, and people brought noise and worry. She did not resent it, but she guarded Tommy more closely, insisting on rest, on quiet afternoons. Ash grew more alert, patrolling the edges of gatherings, ears pricked, ensuring no one strayed into unsafe territory. One evening, after the yard had cleared and the wind had settled into a low murmur, Elena and Silas sat at the table in the lamplight. "You didn't plan this part," she said gently. Silas shook his head. "I planned for winter," he replied. "Not for people." She smiled faintly. "You're good with both," she said. "You just don't like the second one as much." Outside, the shell answered the wind with its now familiar sliding hush. Inside, the air remained even, forgiving. Silas leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare moment of fatigue. The idea had taken root. It had also attracted scrutiny. Both were signs of something that would not be undone easily. The next morning, Arthur Hale returned alone. He stood in the corridor longer this time, feeling the calm, listening to the softened sound of the wind beyond. When he spoke, his voice lacked its earlier edge. "I'll note that with proper bracing and ventilation," he said, "the structure appears stable." He paused. "I'll also note that improper copies are the real hazard." Silas met his gaze. "That's fair." Hale nodded once. It was not approval, but it was no longer resistance. As he left, Ash watched him go, tail still, head high. Silas rested his hand against the warm log wall and understood that proof did not always arrive cleanly. Sometimes it came with noise, with mistakes, with arguments that turned slowly. The house had answered the wind. Now the idea was answering doubt, and like the wind, doubt could be guided, slowed, and made to pass by, without tearing the place apart. Winter didn't retreat after losing an argument. It rarely did. Instead, it changed tactics, the way an old adversary does when brute force no longer brings results. The cold remained sharp, the nights long, but the wind learned patience. It came in cycles now, testing in the early hours, withdrawing by afternoon, returning again after dark with a steadier, quieter persistence that worked on nerves rather than nails. In Laramie, people said the season had settled in for the long haul. They were right, and for the first time in memory, that did not sound like a threat everywhere. Silas Crow felt the change most clearly in the rhythm of his days. Fewer emergency knocks came at odd hours. Fewer men arrived with frost in their beards and panic in their eyes. Instead, they came in daylight, with questions written on scrap paper, with boards measured and remeasured, with a seriousness that suggested this was no longer novelty. It was preparation. One such man arrived on a gray morning, when the snow fell straight down without drifting. His name was Walter Finn, a widower in his early 60s who lived north of town near the rail spur. He was tall but narrow, his shoulders sloped inward as if bracing against something no one else could see. His beard was thin and white, his hands permanently trembling from years of nerve pain after a wagon accident had pinned him in winter long enough to leave its mark. He spoke carefully, conserving breath. I don't need it warm, Walter said, as Silas walked him through the corridor. I just need it steady. He pressed his palm against the metal, then the log. Cold comes in waves, he added. That's what finishes a man. Silas nodded. Steady's what this does best. They talked about spacing, about keeping angles gentle, about not rushing the work when hands were numb. Walter listened with the focus of someone who understood consequences intimately. When he left, he did not ask for help. He simply tipped his hat and said, I'll take my time. That same week, a freight delay left Laramie short on coal. The railroad prioritized the main lines, and smaller depots waited. In other winters, that would have meant crisis. This time, it meant inconvenience. Caldwell noted the difference with a quiet satisfaction that did not quite reach his eyes. He watched the fuel ledger and saw consumption fall, not dramatically at first, but consistently. Men grumbled less, the night fires burned lower, the town breathed easier, if not warmer. Elena saw another change, one she had not expected. Children began to play outside again, briefly and cautiously, but without the frantic edge that came from knowing warmth was fragile. Tommy joined them on clear afternoons, bundled but smiling, Ash trotting beside him like a watchful shadow. Elena kept close, ready to pull him back at the first sign of trouble, but trouble came less often. When Tommy did cough, it was lighter, shorter, the sound of effort, rather than distress. One afternoon, Martha Bell stopped by without announcement. She carried no bag this time, only a folded shawl over her arm. I've been counting, she said as she sat at the table, eyes thoughtful. Less chest sickness this week, still cold but fewer emergencies. She glanced toward the window, where the shell curved past like a protective shoulder. Houses matter, she said. We forgot that for a while. Silas poured her tea and listened. He had learned when to speak and when to let others find their own words. The quiet acceptance did not mean the season had softened entirely. Late January brought a cold snap that pressed harder than anything since the early storms. The wind returned with a new edge, cutting and deliberate, finding weaknesses where it could. One night, near midnight, Ash rose from her place and paced, ears forward, a low sound in her throat. Silas woke instantly. He moved into the corridor and felt it, a subtle shift in tone. Pressure, a new sound under the familiar slide. The wind had found a seam at the roofline where drifting snow had packed and frozen, changing the flow. He worked alone in the dark, lantern swinging, hands burning as he cleared the drift and adjusted the overlap. It took an hour. By the time he finished, the wind had already moved on, denied purchase once again. He stood there afterward, breath steaming, and felt the familiar satisfaction of maintenance performed before failure. This was not a miracle. It was vigilance. The incident became known anyway. In a small town, even quiet victories make noise. Arthur Hale heard of it and arrived the next morning, his expression more curious than critical now. He climbed the ladder Silas set and inspected the adjustment, nodding slowly. This, he said, tapping the seam, is the part people won't remember when they copy it. He looked down. They'll remember the shape, not the upkeep. Silas met his gaze. Then tell them, he said. Hale did. In his next report, he included a paragraph on maintenance, on inspection after storms, on the necessity of understanding local wind behavior. It was not endorsement, but it was instruction, and that mattered more. By February, the transformation was visible from the edge of town. Not every house wore a full shell, but many bore signs of adaptation. Angled wind fences, partial outer skins on exposed sides, widened porches that acted as buffers. Smoke hung less heavily over Laramie. Nights grew quieter, not because winter had relented, but because fewer people were awake fighting it. One evening, Silas stood with Ezra Pike and Henry Caldwell on the rise above the rail yard, watching the lights come on across town. Ezra's beard had grown thicker, his posture looser. You notice, he said, how nobody's laughing anymore? Caldwell smiled faintly. Laughter's a luxury, he said. People use it when they don't understand something yet. They watched a train pull through, sparks briefly bright against the dark. The wind pressed at their backs, then slid past, uninterested. At home, Elena marked the days on the calendar not by storms, but by ordinary things returning. Baking bread without worrying it would go stale from cold, washing clothes without ice forming before they could be hung, sitting to read in the evening without the constant pull toward the stove. These were small freedoms, but they added up to something larger, a winter lived rather than endured. The last visitor of the chapter arrived unexpectedly near the end of the month. He was young, barely 20, with dark hair and a face still undecided about its angles. His name was Thomas Avery, newly arrived from Nebraska, drawn west by rail work and rumors of opportunity. He stood awkwardly in the yard, hat in hand, eyes wide at the sight of the shell. "I heard this is where you learn how to build for winter," he said, earnest and a little afraid. Silas studied him, then gestured toward the corridor. "You don't learn it here," he said. "You learn it by watching the wind." He pointed toward the open plain. "That's your teacher." Thomas nodded, absorbing that as if it were instruction enough. He stayed to help split wood, asked careful questions, listened more than he spoke. When he left, he did so with a different posture than when he arrived, shoulders squared not with confidence but with purpose. As February deepened and the nights remained cruel, Laramie settled into a new understanding. Winter had not been defeated. It had been negotiated with, slowed, and taught to wait outside where it belonged. Silas Crow stood in the corridor one evening, Ash at his side, and felt the steady warmth behind him, the sliding wind beyond. The idea had outgrown him now, carried by other hands in other houses. That was as it should be. He turned back inside, closing the door softly, leaving the winter to pace the plain alone. Spring did not arrive in Laramie with softness. It never had. It came the way winter left, reluctantly, unevenly, with arguments still hanging in the air. Snow remained in the shadows long after the sun climbed higher, and the wind refused to surrender its claim entirely, but something fundamental had shifted. The season no longer owned the town, it merely visited. Silas Crow noticed the change one morning when he woke to light instead of sound. No rattling stovepipe, no groan from the eaves, just the thin gold of early sun slipping through the window and touching the wall where frost used to form. He lay still for a moment, listening out of habit, then smiled faintly at himself. Old instincts died slowly, especially ones earned honestly. Elena was already awake, sitting at the table with a ledger and a pencil, her hair loosely tied back, the sleeves of her blouse rolled to her elbows. She looked up when he entered, eyes warm but alert. "I counted," she said. "We used less than half the wood we did last winter." She tapped the page. "And that's with colder nights." Silas nodded. Numbers mattered, but what mattered more was the way she said it. Not with relief alone, but with quiet confidence, the sound of someone who no longer felt at the mercy of the weather. Tommy burst in from outside moments later, cheeks flushed, boots muddy, Ash trotting proudly at his side. He had been helping Ezra stack scrapwood near the fence, his small hands clumsy but determined. His breathing was easy now, his laughter unbroken. Elena caught Silas's eye over the boy's head, and in that look was the unspoken truth of the entire winter. Whatever else happened, this had been worth it. The town gathered that afternoon, not because anyone called a meeting, but because people had learned where to go when something needed saying. The yard around the Crow house filled slowly, neighbors arriving in ones and twos, some leaning on fence rails, others standing with hands shoved deep into pockets. Ezra Pike stood near the shed, beard flecked with gray now, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been before. Henry Caldwell arrived from the rail yard, coat dusted with coal soot, his expression thoughtful but satisfied. Martha Bell stood slightly apart, arms folded, eyes moving constantly, as if counting breaths even on a warm day. Arthur Hale came last. He dismounted carefully, movements less stiff than they had been months ago, his coat worn now rather than pristine. He had spent the winter traveling between towns, seeing variations of the same idea take root in slightly different forms. It had changed him, not dramatically, but enough to notice. He no longer looked like a man guarding a line. He looked like one redrawing it. Silas had not planned to speak. He rarely did, but Caldwell cleared his throat and nodded toward him, and the quiet that followed carried an expectation Silas understood. He stepped forward, resting one hand on the shell beside him. The metal was warm from the sun, dull and unremarkable, exactly as he liked it. "I didn't build this to prove anything," Silas said. His voice carried without effort, steady and plain. "I built it because my boy couldn't breathe at night, and the wind wouldn't leave us alone." He paused, letting that land where it would. What worked here might not work the same everywhere. Different ground, different wind. The only thing that matters is this: don't fight winter harder than you have to. Watch it, learn where it moves, then make it go around you instead of through you. No one interrupted. Even the wind seemed to hold back, sliding along the edges of the yard without pressing in. Silas nodded once, as if concluding a conversation with himself, and stepped back. That was enough. Arthur Hale cleared his throat. "For the record," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat, "the county will be issuing guidance, not mandates. Guidance." He glanced at Silas, then at the assembled crowd. "Spacing, ventilation, load considerations, maintenance." He hesitated, then added, "based on observed success." It was the closest thing to endorsement anyone expected, and it was received without applause, the way practical truths often are. Men nodded. Women exchanged looks. The matter settled into the town like a stone placed carefully back into a wall. As the gathering thinned, Thomas Avery lingered. He had grown more confident over the weeks, his movements surer, his questions sharper. He stood beside Buck, stroking the horse's neck thoughtfully. "I'm heading north in the fall," he said. "Rail work near Casper. I'm going to build my place the way you showed me." Silas studied him for a moment, seeing not just the boy he had been, but the man he was becoming. "You'll do it your way," he said. "Just remember to leave room for the air." Thomas smiled, nodded, and shouldered his pack. That evening, as the sun dipped, and the town settled into its softer season, Silas walked the perimeter one last time with Ash. The drifts had melted back, revealing the patterns winter had carved. Where snow lingered, where the ground dried first. The shell bore its scars, small dents, weathered seams, the honest marks of use. He ran his hand along it, not possessively, but with gratitude. It had done its job. More than that, it had taught others to do theirs. Inside, Elena prepared supper with the door open, letting the mild air move through the house at her choosing. Tommy sat on the floor, carving a new wooden horse under Ezra's patient supervision, his small hands steady now. Laughter drifted out into the yard, unafraid of being stolen by the wind. Silas stepped into the corridor one final time that season and stood there, feeling the calm he had learned to recognize. He understood now that the house was not the point. The point was what happened after, how knowledge moved when it was earned honestly, how people changed when survival became livable. He turned and went inside, closing the door gently behind him. Outside, the wind continued its endless circuit of the plains, searching for weaknesses, finding fewer than before. Inside Laramie, and inside one small house at its edge, winter had finally learned its place. As this story comes to rest, we're reminded of something the world often forgets. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through patience, through love, through a man who refuses to give up on his family. Perhaps God did not still the Wyoming wind, but he gave one man the wisdom to understand it. And through that understanding, a child slept warm, a family stayed whole, and a town learned to hope again. In our own lives, we face storms too, not always of snow and cold, but of loneliness, fear, illness, and quiet nights when worry feels louder than faith. And yet, again and again, God shows us this truth. We are never asked to be stronger than the storm, only wiser, kinder, and faithful enough to keep going. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that no act of love is too small, and no quiet effort goes unseen. Please share this story with someone who may need comfort tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. It helps this channel reach hearts across the world. And if you believe that stories of hope still matter, consider subscribing so we can continue sharing them together. May God bless you and your home. May He keep you warm in your hardest seasons. And may no child, no animal, and no soul ever face fear alone. Amen.